Hello, and welcome to the Vault podcast. I'm host and reporter Trisha Taurinskas. In August of this year, my colleagues Chris Hagen, who writes under the name C.S. Hagen, and Drew Trafton took on a story that took many of us who live in North Dakota and Minnesota by complete surprise. A reclusive Christian sect known as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church had been operating for years out of the small North Dakota town of Neche, tucked up in the northeast corner of the state, near the Canadian border. The PBCC isn't just local, though. It's a global entity with thousands of followers across Europe, Australia, Canada, and the US. But the secrecy of this group wasn't what shocked us. What shocked us were the allegations made by members of this church who had left. Sexual assault, rampant alcohol abuse, money laundering. Members felt that they were being manipulated emotionally, financially, and at times through threats of violence. Those who left the church were cut off from loved ones and the only support network they'd ever known. And all of this was happening right in our backyard. Chris and Drew's reporting on this is absolutely worth checking out. You can find it all on inforum.com. But over the next couple of episodes, we'd like to give you a little bit more context on how they reported it and hear more about the startling things they learned. We started out by talking about the history of the PBCC. Chris, Drew, thanks for coming on The Vault.
Yeah, thank you for having us on, Trisha.
Yeah, thanks.
Chris, this investigation began with you, and I'm wondering, how did you come across this story?
Well, it was originally came in the form of an anonymous tip to the newsroom. A lady who I still don't know her name either called or sent, I think she sent it an email warning the forum newsroom that a cult had taken over the town of Neche and gave some, not much information, but they had taken over the town, or that they were taking over the town. And so the newsroom passed that tip off to the Vault, and the Vault gave it to me. And I immediately was interested, but also took it with a grain of salt at first. My first steps in just checking this tip out was, of course, the almighty Google. Did not find much on it until I started coming across podcasts. It turns out to have been recorded by former members of this cult called the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, also at times called the Exclusive Brethren. And I started looking for a Neche connection and quite quickly found one in a woman of royal blood, which means that she was an ancestor of one of the universal leaders of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. And she's one of the organizers of this podcast called Get a Life Podcast. And so I listened to a few of those, and then I started figuring out how to contact these people, and started with a woman named Carmen Drever. And she was extremely helpful in giving me history, why they're making the podcast, her own life story later on, and filling in the gaps, because it's a very, very complicated and quite, I guess, as far as religious sects are concerned, it's quite old. It's been around for quite a long time.
I know we've spoken about this before and why covering cults is important to you, but can you share why that is and why maybe you had a different perspective than many journalists when you were interviewing Carmen, getting to know these people, and starting this investigation?
When I was about 7 years old, my family was living in Rogers, Arkansas, and my dad was a mechanical engineer, former captain in the Marine Corps, very tail end of Vietnam War, and somehow they found religion. I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but through this Baptist church that they were attending down in this town called Rogers, Arkansas, they met a couple named Nelda and Dean Long, who had, maybe about a year before they met them, started a kind of a place for kids to go to, kids that were troublesome or orphans or families that were looking for some kind of alternative type of living. And they set up this place called Real Life Ranch in a village, I guess you'd call it, of Little Flock, Arkansas, right in the Ozark Mountains. And so when I was 7 years old, my dad, he sold his house, sold his prized possession, a green MG, quit his job, a very lucrative job in those days, which was probably about $30,000 a year, I'm thinking, at Union Carbide, and sold everything, donated all the money to this ranch, and we moved there as a family. Of course, I was 7 years old at the time and didn't know anything better, didn't know anything different. But we lived and worked there for about 6 years. Went to a one-room classroom where we were stuck in cubicles all school day long. And I'm talking about a cubicle. It wasn't a classroom like you'd have in a normal school, like with a teacher. You learned on your own. You're stuck in this little box, really. And if you had a question, you'd raise a flag. So you'd read and do the work yourself, do a test yourself, and then go grade the test yourself as well. And every once in a while, a teacher would get involved, but not very often. The only real class we had was Spanish class. And that was a room where we, the students sat around a big table and the teacher taught Spanish. There was not much time for play at this place. Once, 5 o'clock in the morning, we were up milking cows, even at 7, 8 years old. After school, we usually go and build rock fences or work in the gardens or some kind of manual labor. All the meals were community. We ate together in a big, huge dining room, kind of cafeteria style. And of course, Sundays, which I dreaded even at a young age, went for about 4 or 5 hours long services, and led mostly by Nelda Long, a woman. I didn't really find out until much later that this place was actually a cult. I was quite young, so I think a lot of the bad things that happened there kind of passed over me.
Sure.
But it was definitely a cult, and it controlled all members, especially finances. And they tried to change the way we think and even the culture. Like holidays were not allowed. Birthdays, they would a birthday party would be everyone, about 100 people, all gathering together, laying hands on your head and praying for your sins after you self-confessed.
On your birthday?
That was
growing up?
Yeah, that was a birthday present. And if you look online, there's only one real mention of it, because it was back in the 80s, long before the internet came along. But there was one birthday party we were at where we were all outside on this big porch, and I remember this. And probably about 60 to 70 of us out there in the middle of prayers or whatever. And it was about 40 feet off the ground, and the porch broke and collapsed, and everyone tumbled down.
Whoa.
Hurting, nearly killing one person, hurting many others, broken backs, broken pelvic bones, legs, arms. One kid, a little bit younger than me, had about 160 stitches across his face, probably from a nail or something. I don't know. But that did make the newspapers, but they did a very good job of trying to keep out of the limelight. Very, very reclusive, very seclusive, separated themselves from society for the most part. And
so how old were you when your family left?
I was about 12 or 13 years old when we left. And that would have been about 1984, I believe it was. Somewhere around there, yeah.
So during those
5-6 years, yeah.
About 5-6 years. So, and during those formative years of your childhood, I'm wondering how that is a part of your story. And I'm wondering how you think it changed your approach when covering the Plymouth Brethren and even interviewing these people who have left.
I think that experience ended up being part of a change in me later on. Today, I'm not a religious person. This might sound like a cop-out, but I would say I'm spiritual, but I'm definitely not. I don't subscribe to any one religion. Thinking after we had left for quite a while, basically in college, is when I really started thinking back on these times. And I'm remembering, times when like the deacons would pull me into a room and force me to speak in tongues, and I would fake it to get out of it.
Yeah.
And they believed me, luckily. Otherwise, we still might be in that room today. Joke, but we would have been in there for a very long time.
Yeah.
And other things that I had seen and witnessed myself, being raised in ultra religious settings, pretty much my whole entire life, kind of made me see the light, I guess, and turned me away from any organized religion. Saying that, though, as a journalist, there are a lot of issues that we cover that we don't agree with, including everything from racism to crime, whatever it is, and we don't agree with it. But that does not mean that we don't hold a responsibility to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, after the reporting was done, one of the spokespeople from the Brethren reached out to me and said he had thought I'd done a pretty fair job with the series that we did, which was surprising to me. But
yes, that is.
I would also say, though, that from my perspective, it was an opportunity like this was one that I couldn't pass up to, because I think I do also have a little bit of a better understanding of where they were coming from, and maybe that helped me ask the right questions, or there was a mutual history that we kind of, although we didn't share it, we could relate to when talking to some of the former members and even members. I was able to talk to one member at length, but didn't really get anything substantive out of it. But I think that kind of experience really helped me to be able to go into this setting and ask some of the right questions, at least.
What did you learn about the history of the group in your investigation?
Yeah, the history, it goes back to about the 1820s, when a group of people, I believe led by a man named John Nelson Darby, began to be dissatisfied with the Anglican Church and some of the traditions and customs and practices of that time in the 1820s. And so he split away from the Anglican Church and created his own. They didn't call it church; they call it meetings, like the Neche meeting hall, or the Saint Pembina meeting hall, Sydney meeting hall. When they say they're going to church, they don't say we're going to church; we're going to meeting. But he tried to set it up in a way where there was no, position like a bishop or a pastor. It was kind of geared by elders, people who were revered within their little group, but there was no one leader. And yet he definitely took the reins and led the PBCC at that time all the way. And this is according to quite a few sources, although it is arguably 100% true. He's credited with creating the last days apocalypse theory, and the return of Christ and the rapture and all of that. He's credited for starting that. And the Plymouth Brethren have a firm belief that they are special, chosen ones, and will be called up, I guess, during the rapture before everyone else. They have a special place in God's heart. And according to former members, they believe that, and they're taught that since you're born into the Brethren. They're taught that from basically the time that they can understand words. Just going back a little bit to the history there, it started in the 1820s, and they sent out missionaries all over the place. They were looking to recruit This is in England. From there, they moved to Australia, New Zealand, even Jamaica, and a couple other countries. And they're still there today, but also to Canada and then eventually the United States. And there are some newspaper clippings from the late 1800s that do reference Brethren, but there's not really much information about them at all. But throughout the years, especially in the 20th century, 1969 or 70, I believe, they've had multiple schisms where people have disagreed with something. And after an incident called the Aberdeen incident, where the leader at that time, Taylor, he was caught having an affair with another member's wife, and he was also a very raging alcoholic. And when he was caught, the Plymouth Brethren split. Many left and started what they call now the Open Brethren, and they're more inclusive to outsiders. Brethren have always had a firm belief of separation from society, but it wasn't really until his reign, they actually call it reign, where they really began to enforce that separation of brethren versus outsiders, or worldlies, as they call them. Like they're not allowed to eat or drink with anyone who has not had communion with the brethren. And that means, me and you, we're outsiders. Brethren really will not talk to us much at all. Like, for instance, if we're in a cafeteria and there's a brethren member and I go sit down beside him or her at the same table, they won't get up and leave necessarily, but they won't instigate any conversation. They will answer a question, but they won't, take an interest or express any interest at all. But you will never be invited to their house. In business, they do fraternize to a degree, but not much. So there really is a complete separation. A lot of people also disagreed with that at the time too. Especially people who are business minded, because it's really difficult to do business with outsiders if you can't take them out to dinner or have a beer and talk about whatever it is they need to talk about. So it was really since the 1970s on when they became when the exclusive brethren, the ones that are in Neche and northeastern North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota, and elsewhere in the United States and across the world. It wasn't until then really that they became kind of secretive, existing in plain view. But one of the things that I found out really quickly is there was almost no media coverage of them at all in the United States until very recently, and that's been typically good news. It's been, like their rapid relief team, which is like their PR face. They're kind of coming out of the shadows a little bit, trying to do some philanthropic work. But in America, almost nothing on them at all, which I found very surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people living in Minnesota, North Dakota have never heard about this or had never until your reporting. And I'm curious, considering one of their main beliefs is that speaking to outsiders openly is wrong and against their belief system. How did that make reporting difficult? Because obviously we want to reach out. You mentioned earlier, we want to be fair and give them an opportunity to address allegations. So did they speak with you?
Not kind of. Of course, they try to go through spokespeople. One, a secular guy, a person far outside the Brethren, was hired to probably just for this purpose of speaking to me and Drew, answering some of our questions. Many of the questions that we asked through spokespeople, which included through their school system, and I think there's a total of 3 or 4 different spokespeople that we were able to contact, 3 of them being inside the Brethren, 1 outside. They would answer questions, deny certain things that people have said about them, certain accusations, but there were other questions, especially related to finance or abuse. Let's go with finance first. They would not really answer at all, except for in very generic terms. They would not answer any specific details. Like I'd ask a series of questions, they'd give me one answer, and which was definitely not satisfying from my perspective. And then on abuse, they would answer the questions, but emphatically state things that former members totally disagree with, saying that is not the case at all.
Mm-hmm.
So there, it makes, in the end of the day, after the series came out, and I had no intention of doing this, their answers to me made them look poorly. It gave them a poor face in the eyes of the public, which if I had been able to get a sit-down interview with a high-ranking member in the Brethren or Bruce Hales himself, which I'm still hoping for, I think it would have been a lot better for them. Right. But I can only work with what they would give me. And Drew and I, we both gave them ample opportunity multiple times to answer questions. I don't know how many emails back and forth.
I think you had to have sent 30 or more. I mean, it seemed very, it was very thorough. But I think just to add on to that, or to speak to that a little bit, I think part of the frustration or the approach to trying to garner information was stifled just by the lack of hierarchy that the Brethren have. And I think that might be purposeful because, as Chris mentioned, there is no bishop. There's no structure to the church. Like we understand through our reporting and speaking to former members that there is somewhat of a structure set up. But what it allows for is if you're going to ask somebody for an interview, and in our experience, they would often say, well, I need to talk to my supervisor, or, yeah, we'll have someone reach out to you. But that someone was never identified or clearly identifiable. And so it provides them cover since they're in their minds, I think they're, on equal footing with each other. There's not a person that has that ultimate accountability. Right. Not that that's necessarily the reality of the situation. And I think Chris's reporting and the folks whom we talked to clearly show that there is a hierarchy in place, but they certainly would refute that and did refute that. That there's one person to talk to or one person to go to. And it was the same with their business relationships as well. They would say that the church itself doesn't have any formal relationship with their businesses or the businesses that are affiliated with the church, but they, as we've mentioned, they're exclusive and they have to eat and they have to do these things and they have to operate in the world, and they've set up their own network. I mean, their own secluded, isolated culture. Yeah. And so there clearly are business relationships, as there would be naturally in that situation. And that just allowed them to kind of brush us off, I think, at a lot of moments.
There's a part in your documentary where it shows both of you going into a building and trying to speak with someone. Can you guys talk about what it was like being there? Because like you said, you did try. I mean, in addition to the emails, you were there. And so what did that feel like when you were in Neche? How were you received?
So we went up to Neche early one morning, and it was a few hours. It took us a few hours to get up there. And we had certain places that we wanted to go, and we knew that we were going to have to do a fair bit of door knocking because we hadn't received many responses. And we decided at first to go to the school because I had intended to shoot a few bits of reporting from the school. I had a preliminary story written up, and I wanted to get a few of those parts that I knew involved the school on camera. And we decided to go there first because it was kind of on our way. And when we pulled up to the school, we got out of the car, and I would say within 2 minutes, there was someone or two people from the school who had stepped outside wondering what we were doing there, which is fair because, you have people with a camera, and we were on public property. We weren't doing anything illegal.
Yeah. I mean, I don't imagine they see many people out there, but then, to see you guys with a camera, yeah, I can understand that would raise some concern for them initially.
Yeah. And those folks were really friendly. They gave us the standard line that, we need to chat with our supervisor. They took Chris's business card and told us they'd get back to us. And so we just went about what we were going to do. There weren't any kids outside or anything like that. It was the summertime. And we later found out school was in session at that time. We thought that perhaps they had been let out earlier than that because it was fairly late in June. And we were finished wrapping up our shooting there, and we were getting back in our car, and someone pulled up in a pickup truck and rolled down their window. And the way they pulled in, I've been a reporter long enough to feel the passive aggressiveness coming through.
Yeah.
That driving style where maybe they're going a little too fast and hit the brakes a little too hard coming up on you.
Yeah.
And they pulled off the road and rolled down the window and asked, what are you doing here? And we deal with that. Reporters deal with that all the time. And so, that was a pretty typical experience, and we told them what we were doing here. But the fact that had happened all within probably 5 minutes, just kind of, I think that tipped us off for what the rest of the day was going to be like.
Sure. Set the tone.
Yeah. Yeah. And that fellow, we got in our car and drove off, and he followed us for a while too. We had about a 20-minute drive ahead of us to get to our next stop. And he was with us for quite a while there.
Wow. And, I'd like to talk about the fact that you guys spoke to ex-members in Neche. So
yeah, can I interject just a bit? I went back up to Neche twice after our first visit, looking for people to talk to. It's just kind of sometimes just sitting in the town, just absorbing it all in, the sounds, the sights, all that. And the third trip there, this is probably the day or two after, I had an interview with a man from New Zealand who told me that they have a prayer death list that they circulate amongst their meetings occasionally, praying for the removal of people from this earth. And when I asked them to clarify what that meant, it meant death. They pray for the death of people who are opposers, they call them. That was running in my mind as I was trying to find members who are supposedly in a meeting, because they have daily meetings, and racing between St. Vincent, Pembina, and Neche. I was in a car traveling as quickly as I dared with that in the back of my mind. And I think that also my upbringing in a cult, although to clarify, I'm personally not calling them a cult. A lot of people do, but it's not my job to define what they are. It's just my job is to report what we found. But my experience in a cult as a young kid, that was haunting for me, driving down these rural roads, going as fast as I dared and a little bit over the speed limit, perhaps, because I knew I was on a time crunch to find people that I could talk to. And I eventually did find them. But it was that prayer death list was on my mind quite heavily during those quick trips between these towns, wondering, if God is really real, and if he's really out there and he's on their side, all he has to do is make me take this corner a little bit too fast, have a flat tire and flip or something. That was going in my mind the whole time.
Yeah, I do want to also say that when we were there, in town, we did have a little bit of contact with we had contact with a few people while we were in town, non-members and one member. He had left the door to his business open because they were remodeling, and you could tell that it was an awkward situation for him. And obviously we know that it was awkward because they're not allowed to talk with us. Mm-hmm. And so having that conversation can be difficult. Most of the doors we knocked on were locked. And most of we would occasionally see maybe people move. You could see through frosted glass or something, and you knew that people were there, but they didn't want to come to the door. They didn't answer the door. And I don't know if that's because that's just standard operating procedure where they are, or if mm-hmm. they just knew we were there and they didn't want to talk to us.
And Chris, you mentioned that there hasn't been coverage in the United States. There has been in Australia, and we'll get to that in part 2. But that means that this was the first time they were seeing members of the media, to the best of our knowledge, in their town.
I would assume so. They might have had some. They might have. I can't say for 100% sure, but as far as the lack of reporting that I found online, yes, I would agree to that. But it's possible that they had some run-ins with reporters from time to time that those reports aren't online. Before the mm-hmm. 90s, before the 80s, even. Sure. It's possible, but I just couldn't find them. Mm-hmm. They're not on the internet. They used to take subscriptions to newspapers like the Grand Forks Herald, but their separation doctrine at one point, because the delivery boy was kicked out, excommunicated, which in their terms is called withdrawn from, and since he was now then considered evil, everyone in the Brethren dropped their subscriptions to the Grand Forks Herald at that time.
Wow.
Which I thought was really interesting anecdote on how far they will go to separate themselves from evil, not to be contaminated by anything evil.
And they have come up with some really interesting ways to share media, even within. Typically, from what we heard, it usually involved people who were trying to get out, but they would use, and I don't want to say the exact methods they used, but they were surprisingly adept at technology and would use various ways to share certain files because they do use a form of the internet. It's just very closely curated and monitored, but they can still receive files and things like that. And they do a few clever things to get around those monitoring tools.
Yeah. I also talked to one Symington. In Neche, some people don't even know of the Plymouth Brethren by name. They call them Symingtons.
Okay.